Rimmer sat on the open terrace in his half-devastated dinner suit of the night before and gazed down at the metallic blue time machine drunkenly parked skew-whiff in the ornamental gardens of the Palace of Versailles. Breakfasting with him were 5 of his stag-night companions: John F. Kennedy, Vincent van Gogh, Albert Einstein, Louis XVI, and Elvis Presley.
"That was a heck of a night," Kennedy sparkled. "One heck of a night."
Einstein snorted in agreement and continued absently buttering the underside of his tie. Julius Caesar stumbled through the French windows out onto the terrace with an ice pack perched on his head.
"Can anyone tell me," he asked in faltering English, "where in Jupiter's name we got this?"
He held aloft a large orange and white striped traffic cone.
"I woke up in bed with it this morning."
Van Gogh cracked an egg into his tomato juice and downed it with a shudder.
"It's not a good night," he grinned, "if you don't get a traffic cone."
You want that?"
Elvis Presley nodded at Rimmer's deviled kidneys and, without waiting for a reply, scraped them onto his already full plate. A colourless smile trickled across Rimmer's upper lip.
"Avez-vous some, Alka-Seltzer?" "One heck of a night," Kennedy repeated.
And he was right. As bachelor night parties went, it had been a bit of a cracker. A flash frame slammed into Rimmer's brain, a scene from the night before. He was standing on a table in a 1922 Chicago speakeasy, dancing the black bottom with Frank the Enforcer Nitty's girlfriend, and complaining for the umpteenth time that his mineral water tasted as if someone had poured 3 double vodkas into it. Then, he couldn't remember the order, but they had definitely dropped in on one of Caligula's orgies. Rimmer must have been fairly drunk by then, because he remembered spending at least 20 minutes trying to chat up a horse. At some point, they'd been in ancient Egypt, and Rimmer had lost a tooth trying to give the Sphinx a giant love bite. Then someone, Rimmer thought it was Elvis, had suggested a curry. And Rimmer, who hated curries, had been dragged, complaining through time, back to India in the days of the Raj, where everyone had ordered a mutton vindaloo, except for Rimmer, who had a cheese omelette served with ludicrously thick chips. The cry had gone up for more liquor, and Rimmer suggested— What did he suggest? There was a block, so it must have been something fairly bad. Some kind of restaurant. They'd crashed a private party, and all the people there seemed fairly put out when Rimmer and his cronies showed up dancing and singing. There were a dozen or so diners, all men, all bearded. Rimmer closed his eyes and groaned. They'd gate-crashed the Last Supper. What had he done? What had he said? He'd been shouting drunk.
"Private bloody party? Our money's as good as anyone's."
12 of them had stood up and threatened to punch Rimmer out, but the one who'd remained seated had told the others to sit down again.
"Do one of your tricks," Rimmer had insisted. "Come on, I'm getting married tomorrow, that one with the fish, it's brilliant."
A heck of a night. Rimmer looked at his real-time watch.
"Well, Louis, me old buckaroo," he said to the King of France, "we'd better be making tracks. Big kissy-kissy to Marie and the Dauphin. Thanks for the servant girls. See you at the wedding."
Louis XVI thanked Rimmer for the Ray-Ban sunglasses and the Sony Walkman and bade him farewell. Rimmer gingerly made his way across the lawns towards the time-copter, followed by Kennedy, Van Gogh, Einstein, and Caesar. Elvis crammed a steak in his mouth, stuffed a second in his pocket, grabbed 4 bread rolls, and followed them. The man in the air traffic control tower radioed clearance to materialize, and the time-copter bloomed into existence, and chuddered to rest on the tarmacadammed runway. The disembarkation door hinged to the ground, and the world's richest man clicked down the steps towards the waiting limo. 2 steps down, the screaming started. Hordes of teenage girls standing on the observation balcony swept forward in tides of pubescent adoration.
"Annie!" they roared. "We love you!"
Rimmer waved half-heartedly and shot them the thinnest of his thin smiles, before he was surrounded by a phalanx of sober-suited security guards who ushered him to the leather comfort of the limo's interior. The 8 motorcyclists twisted their throttle grips and led the cavalcade forward as it swished imperiously past passport control and the customs building and headed towards the exit. Rimmer flicked idly through the stack of magazines on the limo's mahogany table, Time, Life, and Newsweek. He noted with only mild interest that his portrait graced the cover of all 3. According to Life, he'd just been voted World's Sexiest Man, World's Best-Dressed Man, and Pipe Smoker of the Year. Rimmer smiled. He didn't even own a pipe, much less smoke one. Success breeds success, he thought. The cavalcade fought its way through the screaming fans milling around the airport exit.
Annie! Don't marry her!
Flattened, adoring faces squashed up against the grey smoke glass, all of them dizzy with desire for Arnold J. Rimmer. Rimmer was perfectly well aware that he was in the wrong plane of the wrong dimension of reality, and quite honestly, he didn't give 2 hoots. The limousine gently disentangled itself from the sobbing frenzy of teenage girls and silently accelerated down the freeway, followed by a shower of moist female underwear. 3 million years out in deep space, a dilapidated mining ship drifts pointlessly round in a huge, aimless circle. On board, its 4 crew members sit in a horseshoe, trapped in the ultimate computer game, a game that plugs directly into the brain and enables them to experience a world created by their own fantasies. The game is called Better Than Life, and very few ever escape its thrall. Very few can give up their own personally sculpted paradise. Sparkling lights looped from tree to tree along the main street, above an assortment of parked cars hummocked in white. A small brass band umpired discordant but cheery carols in the town square, as last-minute shoppers slushed through the snow, exchanging seasonal greetings and stopping occasionally to join in a favourite carol. In the fictional town of Bedford Falls, it was Christmas Eve. But then again, in the fictional town of Bedford Falls, it was always Christmas Eve. Lister crossed the main street, his 2 sons perched on either shoulder, and headed for the toy shop. As they passed the jailhouse, Bert the cop was removing a wanted poster from the front window. The poster was yellow and gnarled, and offered a $5 reward for information leading to the arrest of Jesse James and his gang.
About time I took this thing down,
Bert said sheepishly. There hadn't been a single crime in Bedford Falls for over 30 years, not since that hot summer day when Mrs. Hubble was arrested for taking a 3-cent trolley ride, having paid only a 2-cent fare. Lister slid the twins from his shoulders and grasped their tiny hands as the 2 4-year-olds gazed mouths ajar at the large blue sailing boat on sale for $2.25 in the toy shop window. Suddenly, the door jangled open, and old Mr. Mulligan appeared in the doorway, straightening out the yacht's sails.
"Now then, me lads," he brogued. "Would I be correct in thinking you'll be after doing business with me in respect of a certain sailing vessel? Only, you've been standing out there with your faces pressed up against me window so often these past few months, you're beginning to wear away the pavement outside me shop."
"Yes, sir, we are, sir,"
said Bexley.
"We've been saving up all year. Show 'em the money, Jim."
Jim took out his spider box and carefully unwrapped the 2 wrinkled dollar bills and poured out the mound of coppers.
"Here it is, sir, $2.25.
As old Mr. Mulligan held out the boat, Henry, the town down-and-out, shuffled sadly by, his flimsy coat tugged tight around his frail shoulders. He took a futile swig from a bottle concealed in a brown paper bag and threw it in a waste bin.
"Merry Christmas, gentlemen,"
he slurred. Jim gazed up at his stubble-swathed face.
"Where are you spending Christmas, Mr. Henry?"
"Well, that's a very good question."
Henry dragged a tattered sleeve across his nose.
Being the Saddle jailhouse is closed for the Yuletide period, and the Bel Air Hotel Presidential Suite is fully booked, it looks like the park bench Hilton for old Henry.
What are you going to eat?
asked Bexley.
Don't worry about me, boy. I always share a fine Christmas dinner with the ducks up on Potter's Pond.
The twins turned and faced each other. Finally they both nodded, and Bexley turned back to Henry and held out his hand.
Me and Jim would like you to have this, Mr. Henry. Merry Christmas.
What's this?
Henry tried to focus on the money in his hand.
You can get a room at old Ma Bailey's boarding house,
said Jim,
and have a proper Christmas like the rest of us.
Henry's bloodshot eyes filled with tears, and his voice cracked.
Well, now,
he barely whispered.
You'd be giving me your Christmas money.
Lister looked down at his feet.
Deep down, you're a really good person,
said Jim.
You just got sad when old Mrs. Henry went to heaven.
Lister sucked in his cheeks, and old Mr. Mulligan took out a large handkerchief and noisily blew his nose.
Look at me. I'm kind of pieces,
Henry blubbed.
What would my Mary say if she could see me now? She'd give me such a talking to. My ears would be ringing for a week.
No, she wouldn't, Mr. Henry.
Bexley shook his head.
She'd say you brought up 2 fine children single-handed and sent them both to college. You only took to the bottle when the angels had to take them away too.
Lister snuffled and whimpered and accepted Mulligan's handkerchief. Henry bent down and pressed the money back into Jim's hand.
I can't take this from you boys, but if I could just borrow $1 to get myself a haircut and a shave, there's a sweeping job going down at the drugstore. I'll pay you back 10 times over.
Jim and Bexley smiled.
Merry Christmas, Henry.
Jim folded the single dollar bill around the 25 cents and placed it carefully back into his spider box.
Come on, Dad,
he said quietly.
Let's go back home.
Wait,
called Mulligan.
Have I told you about me winter sale just this minute started? Lots of bargains. Take, for instance, this fine blue boat, formerly $2.25, now reduced to $1.25.
He handed the boat to the boys. Lister started sobbing unashamedly, which set Henry off. The 2 men embraced one another, and were soon joined by old Mr. Mulligan and Bert the cop. They stood there in a 4-way hug, bawling hysterically.
That's so beautiful,
Lister was trying to say between whimpering convulsions.
You got 2 fine boys there. You should...
But Henry couldn't finish. He buried his head in Lister's shoulder and was off again.
They were prepared to give up the boat to help out Henry,
Mulligan blubbered.
That's the real spirit of Christmas.
said Bert, and they all dissolved in a fresh paroxysm of wailing. This was the kind of thing that happened all the time in the fictional town of Bedford Falls. It was that kind of place. The 12-wheeled juggernaut hammered down the narrow country lane, decapitating hedgerows and smashing through branches as it lurched on and off the road, its huge, wide wheels carved deep, ugly ruts in the fresh-laid snow. Its air horn sounded as it dragged round a tight bend and straightened out too soon, ripping through a picket fence and flattening a metal road sign. The sign clattered across the road and toppled into a ditch as the juggernaut thundered out of control, down towards the twinkling lights of the town below. Smashed and scarred by tire tracks, the road sign lay on its back in a ditch. "Welcome to Bedford Falls," it said. "Population 3,241. Very soon, the information on the sign would be hopelessly inaccurate. The 5-piece brass band staggered its way through God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, all, that is, except for old Billy Bailey, the tuba player, who was still staggering through Hark the Herald Angels Sing from 3 carols earlier. Almost the entire population of Bedford Falls stood around the giant Christmas tree in the town square, their sweet, discordant voices drifting up into the evening sky. Lister, with Bexley and Jim on his shoulders again, was sandwiched between Mr. Mulligan and Henry. Henry, with his freshly shaven face and his bristling new haircut, sang louder than anyone. The carol finished, and everyone applauded. Minutes later the tuba finished too, and everyone applauded once more. The five-piece band struck up again. 4 of them started Silent Night, and after a gulp from his hip flask, Billy Bailey tore into God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. He was definitely catching up. Across the street, the door of 220 Sycamore opened, and Christine Kachansky ran over to join them, clutching a bag of hot-roasted chestnuts. She linked her arm in Lister's and planted a warm kiss on his chilled cheek.
"Hey, listen,"
Lister smiled.
"Old Henry's got nowhere to stay."
He didn't even need to finish the sentence.
"I've already made up the spare bed. He can stay with us for as long as he likes."
She flashed her famous smile, the smile that made her face light up like a pinball machine awarding a bonus game. The smile Lister had fallen in love with. She hugged him tighter, and they shared the carol sheet. Suddenly Lister was aware of a loud, blaring drone cutting through the carol. He looked around. The dull monotone sounded again, now even louder, now even closer. Lister turned. Over the crest of the hill that led down to the main street, the sudden dazzle of 8 huge headlights glared down towards them. The hooter sounded again. Lister squinted against the glare and made out the shape of the rogue juggernaut. It was out of control, and heading straight for the carol-singing crowd in the town square. Rimmer gazed down from the balcony windows of his colonial mansion at the blur of black-suited waiters who dashed frantically about with increasingly elaborate flower arrangements. Cranes hung marinated giraffe carcasses over the clay-pit fires, while an army of pastry chefs put the finishing touches to the wedding cake, which featured as its centerpiece an Olympic-sized swimming pool full of vintage champagne. So this wasn't reality. So what? Reality, it struck Rimmer, was a place where bad things could happen, and bad, vile, unspeakable things had happened to him on an almost daily basis the entire period he'd spent there. Why should he subscribe to a reality in which he was an outright failure, a loser with no equal, unloved, unfulfilled, ungifted, and many other words too legion to list, all beginning with the prefix un? The unreality offered by Better Than Life was far more palatable.
Mr. Rimmer, sir?"
A bespectacled man in a brown tweed suit quivered obsequiously at the door.
"It's all ready, sir. Shall I bring it through?"
Rimmer nodded.
"If you'd just like to slip out of that one, we'll see how it feels."
Rimmer pressed the release catch concealed in his navel, and with a whoosh, his essence floated out of his body. He felt slightly sheepish hovering around the room, temporarily bodiless, and was glad when the man in the brown tweed suit returned pushing a stretcher.
"Here it is, sir. Perhaps you'd like to try it on."
Rimmer changed his body more often than most people had a haircut. Every time he detected the slightest wrinkle or sign of wear, he'd trade it in for a brand new model. And why not? Out there in reality, he didn't have a body. He was a hologram. Here, in Better Than Life, it was therefore only natural that his psyche had fantasized the science that made body-swapping possible. But with every body swap, Rimmer's face remained the same. It was the one part of him he refused to change. Without his own face, he argued, it would feel like his success belonged to someone else. The men pulled back the sheet, revealing Rimmer's pristine new form, and Rimmer's essence slid into it gratefully. He wriggled his new shoulders and stretched out his new arms.
"Comfortable, sir?"
inquired the body tailor. Rimmer murmured non-committally and walked across to the full-length dress mirror. He looked his new physique up and down. It was virtually identical to the body he'd just vacated, with a few minor tweaks and adjustments. The pectorals were slightly better defined, and the stomach wall a tad more muscular.
"Not bad,"
he conceded grudgingly.
penis still isn't big enough. Sir, honestly, any bigger and you'll have a balance problem.
Rimmer nodded. The appendage was fairly gargantuan, and certainly sizable enough to put the fear of God into anyone who stood next to him at a urinal, which was all he was interested in. The tailor was right. He couldn't keep on asking for an extra half-inch or so to be added to his favourite organ. It was fast reaching the stage where he would become the only man in history who dressed on both the right and the left-hand side simultaneously. Rimmer dismissed the tailor and started to slide his latest body into his crisp new morning suit. Yes, indeedy. This place certainly had the edge over reality. Here he was a god, and everything was perfect. Well, almost everything. Still, that was behind him now. Juanita Chicata was history. The world's #1 model and actress no longer kept her cosmetics in his bathroom. The much-publicized court case dragged on for months, and Rimmer had found the whole experience thoroughly galling. Preposterously, the Brazilian bombshell had denied adultery, and Rimmer's lawyers had been forced to parade Juanita's ex-lovers through the witness stand. It took 5 days. The pool attendant, the gardener, her tennis instructor, 2 butlers, 4 chauffeurs, 7 delivery boys, a seemingly endless stream had flowed through the courtroom and testified to their indiscretions with his wife. Worst of all had been the exhibits. Exhibit A, a large carton of whipped cream. Exhibit B, a skin-diving suit with the bottom cut out. Exhibit C, a bucket full of soapy frogs. Soapy frogs? On and on it went, until by Exhibit Q, an inflatable dolphin with battery-operated fins. Rimmer could stand the humiliation no longer, and he'd agreed to settle out of court. The alimony agreement had been of historical magnitude. In fact, it would have been cheaper for Rimmer to support the entire population of Bolivia in perpetuity rather than subscribe to the settlement he did. But it was worth it. It was worth every single naught to get that crazy, dangerous, gorgeous woman out of his life. Helen couldn't have been more different. Good Bostonian stock, society family, old money, normal libido. Helen was nice. Not just nice, of course. That made her sound bland. She was nice, obviously, but also she was very sensible. No berserk, china-hurling tantrums for her. No satanic, knife-wielding charges at his naked person. No embarrassing, bellowed arguments in humiliatingly expensive restaurants. No, that wasn't Helen's style at all. Helen, it seemed, had no temper to lose. Dear, sensible Helen, with her short, sensible legs, her thick, sensible ankles, and her sturdy, sensible underpants. The first time Rimmer had encountered them, these leviathans of underwear, lying on his bed, he climbed under them, mistakenly assuming they were a small duvet. Rimmer thought with a shudder about Juanita's underwear. That wasn't very sensible. Ghostly threads of spun black silk that stretched wickedly across her flat brown belly. You could have swallowed her entire lingerie collection without needing a glass of water. Well, as Helen had sensibly pointed out, she'd pay for that in time. Rheumatism, arthritis. What horrors lurked in Juanita's autumnal years? What price would be exacted for wearing panties that offered as much protection and warmth as a spider's web? Rimmer hurled back his head and brayed a bilious, joyless laugh, an even mixture of malice and pain. God, she would suffer. By the time she was 23, she'd probably need a walking frame or something, just to get around. She'd probably have to use the disabled toilet. And all because she'd eschewed the large, warming expanses of thick, elasticated cotton that graced the legs, thighs, and quite a lot else of Mrs. Rimmer Mark II. If Rimmer had thought about it, he might have asked himself why, in a landscape moulded by his own mind, Juanita existed at all. Even so, it was unlikely he'd have come up with the right answer. The truth of it was, his psyche just didn't like him. Better Than Life operated on an entirely subliminal level. It wasn't possible, for instance, to wish for a turbocharged Harley-Davidson and blip it appeared. Early, non-addictive versions of the game operated in exactly this manner, and proved boring and unplayable after only a few days. The secret to BTL's addictive quality was that it gave the players things they didn't even know they desired by tapping their subconscious minds. It pandered to the players' deepest, most secret longings, which was all very well so long as you weren't a total psychological screw-up. Unfortunately, Rimmer was. Subconsciously, Rimmer felt he was worthless. He didn't deserve success, and he certainly didn't deserve happiness. What he deserved was punishment. Punishment and misery. And Better Than Life, which catered to his innermost desires, wasn't about to disappoint him. The carved ivory phone purred into life on the Louis XV writing bureau. Rimmer waited his customary 20 rings before he strode over to the desk and picked up the receiver. It wasn't much of a conversation from Rimmer's point of view. All he said was, "What?" 5 times. The first "what" was a flat, evenly delivered inquiry. The second was a mixture of incredulity and amusement. The third was loud and angry. The fourth was screeched and hysterical, and the fifth, sad, quiet, and resigned. He replaced the receiver gently in its cradle, then rolled his body into a ball, and began moaning quietly on the bed.
Knock!
The cat leant heavily in the saddle, his left hand firmly gripping the leathery neck of his gigantic brontosaurus as it galloped downfield towards the unguarded goal. His mallet arced up in the air and flashed briefly in the sunlight before sweeping deftly down and blasting the small, furry creature between the 2 white posts.
Knock!
The small, furry creature smacked into the left-hand post and ricocheted out.
Thunk! Blat!
The cat hauled the lumbering dinosaur to his left and met the rebounding ball of fur square on the polished heel of his wooden mallet, sending it once more inexorably goalwards. The creature timidly opened one eye and saw the looming goalpost. It hammered into the right-hand post, rebounded across the goal, and spanked into the left-hand post before spinning back into the goal net.
Goal! Ow!
Creature polo was the cat's favourite game. Unnecessary cruelty to small furry animals was very much part of his psychological makeup. Plus, he got to dress up in some really neat duds. A huge-bosomed Valkyrie dressed in scanty armour reined in her triceratops and patted the cat on the back.
Nice goal. Great stick work.
The cat flashed his perfect teeth and wiggled an eyebrow.
Baby, my stick work is always great.
The Valkyrie's eyes narrowed seductively, and she growled with lust.
Get off me!
The cat grinned.
Can I keep my trousers on for 5 seconds? We're in the middle of a match here.
The ball untangled itself wearily from the net, stretched its tiny limbs, and gulped several times in a vain attempt to clear its head. A whistle blew. A voice cried,
Mirror break!
And 2 more scantily clad Valkyrie sex slaves raced onto the field carrying an elaborate 6-foot-long gilt-framed mirror. For a full 10 minutes the cat stared gooey-eyed at his reflection, transfixed as ever by his own incredible good looks. There was good-looking, there was great-looking, and there was him. God, it was cruel to have been born a male, and have a reflection that was also male, forcing him into a platonic relationship with his own image. All too soon the whistle blew again, and the mirror break was over. With a heavy heart, the cat watched the 2 Valkyries charge back to the touchline with the looking-glass as the small, furry creature scuttled gamely back to the centre spot for the next knock-off.
To knock! Squelch!
New ball!
Called another Valkyrie, umpiring on the touchline. A second furry animal got up from the bench, unzipped its miniature tracksuit, performed a bizarre variety of warm-up exercises, and jogged chirpily to the centre spot.
To knock!
2 furry creatures, and a personal hat-trick later, the cat stood in the shade of the marquee's green awning, sipping a celebratory goblet of milk, while one of his army of Valkyries noisily performed an indecent act on his body. The cat sighed. What a nice day he was having. This was just perfection. He had his huge, remote Gothic castle, surrounded by its moat of milk. He had a limitless supply of cute, furry animals to be cruel to. And finally, he'd settled down. He'd met the dozen or so women who were right for him, and his wandering days were over. Mechanoids weren't supposed to have desires and longings, but Crichton did. Originally, he'd entered the game to rescue the others. He was a sanitation mechanoid, programmed to clean, and in theory should have been immune to the game's lure. But he wasn't. In theory, leaving BTL was simple. All the player had to do was to want to leave. All the player had to do was imagine an exit and pass through it, back to reality. Crichton had imagined his gateway easily enough, but as he was about to pass under the pink neon exit sign, a cafeteria materialized to his right. In the window was a handwritten card which read, "Dishwasher wanted." The cafeteria was deserted, but in the kitchen, stacked ceiling high, were several huge towers of dirty dishes piled around a sink. Now what kind of sanitation mechanoid would he have been if he'd ignored those greasy, food-stained plates?
"Oh, I'll just wash a few," he thought. "Reduce the pile a bit."
8 months later, he was still there, still washing, still surrounded by stacks of dirty dishes. Finally, he'd realized he'd been duped. The game had found his innermost desire, and he'd scurried off ashamed. Mechanoids weren't supposed to have desires. Back in the 21st century, as robotic life became more and more sophisticated, it was generally accepted that something was needed to keep the droids in check. For the most part, they were stronger and often more intelligent than human beings. Why should they submit to second-class status, to a lifetime of drudgery and service? Many of them didn't. Many of them rebelled. Then it occurred to a bright young systems analyst at Android International that the best way to keep the robots subdued was to give them religion. Hallelujah! The concept of Silicon Heaven was born. A belief chip was implanted in the motherboard of every droid that now came off the production line. Almost everything with a hint of artificial intelligence was programmed to believe that Silicon Heaven was the electronic afterlife, the final resting place for the souls of all electrical equipment. The concept ran thus. If machines served their human masters with diligence and dedication, they would attain everlasting life in mechanical paradise when their components finally ran down. In Silicon Heaven, they would be reunited with their electrical loved ones. In Silicon Heaven, there would be no pain or suffering. It was a place where the computer never crashed, the laser printer never ran out of toner, and the photocopier never had a paper jam. At last they had solace. They were every bit as exploited as they'd always been, but now they believed there was some kind of justice at the end of it all. Crichton believed in Silicon Heaven. Of course, he'd heard rumors that all machines were programmed to hold this belief, but as far as he was concerned, that was nonsense. For was it not written in the electronic Bible, authorized Panasonic version,
"And some will come among ye, and yea, from their mouths shall come doubts. But turn ye from them, heed them not. For it is harder for a droid who disbelieveth to pass through the gates of Silicon Heaven than it is for a din-to-din coaxial cable to connect up to a standard European SCART socket."
Mechanoids shouldn't have fantasies, not if they wanted to get into Silicon Heaven. Crichton genuflected the sign of the crossed circuit and stumbled up the path towards the cat's golden-towered castle. He was going to make amends. He was going to rescue them all from their paradise. The air horn thundered into the night air as the 12-wheeled juggernaut slewed sideways across the ice into Bedford Falls' main street. The reveling carolers stood like a waxwork tableau as the giant tanker jackknifed into an uncontrollable skid and started to plough relentlessly through the line of shops. It slammed through Mulligan's window, showering the street with teddy bears, dolls, and lethal shards of glass. It demolished Old Man Gower's drugstore, which ignited in a blue plume of chemical flame. It smashed through Pop Buckley's pet shop, sending rabbits, puppies, and canaries bolting, twittering, and flapping out into the night. Next, it took out the entire ground floor of Ma Bailey's boarding house before caroming through Ernie's gas station, uprooting the single pump and sending raw gasoline pulsing over the forecourt. A spark from the Juggernaut's fender caught the spreading pool, and a pretty orange mushroom thumped up into the night sky. A wall of flame dashed across the wooden rooftops, feeding hungrily on the rotten dry timbers. Within moments, the remaining shop facades teetered forward and crashed into the street's melting sludge. And still on it went, this juggernaut from hell, demolishing everything in its path. Round and round it span, like a clumsy bull on a skating rink, locked in a 360-degree skid. Lister watched helplessly as the juggernaut's tail sliced through the giant Christmas tree, sending it tottering through the first floor of the empty orphanage. The impact flicked the truck's cab onto its side, and it twisted free of the trailer before slithering across the main street and finally coming to rest in the sitting room of 220 Sycamore Avenue. There was an ominous creak, and both side walls collapsed from the bottom up, showering the cab with plaster and brickwork. Lister stood in the crowd, clutching Kochanski and the twins, and watched as the cab door opened. A leg in a laddered fishnet stocking hooked itself over the side of the upended cab, followed by some peroxide blonde hair. Lister was too far away to read the tattoo on the woman's inner thigh, but it read, "Heaven this way," and was accompanied by an arrow pointing groinwards. The woman jumped to the ground and staggered in her 8-inch stiletto heels over the rubble towards the dumbstruck crowd.
"Is everyone okay?" she said. "My heel got stuck under the air brake."
She tugged pointlessly at her ludicrously short black rubber skirt and tried to rearrange her bosom so that at least 30% of her mighty breasts remained inside her tight red bolero.
"Bloody things,"
she muttered.
"Is this Bedford Falls?"
Bert the cop stepped forward. "It was, lady." He held out his hand. "You got any ID, ma'am?"
"ID?"
She started rummaging through her shoulder bag.
"I dunno, hang on."
She tipped the bag upside down, scattering the floor with a selection of marital aids, French letters, and half-eaten sandwiches.
"Oh, shitty death,"
she blushed. Bert walked towards her and caught a full blast of her perfume in his face. When he'd recovered sufficiently to speak, he said, "I think you better come with me," and placed his hand on her arm. The woman sighed.
"Look, I don't suppose this counts, but, I know for a fact that I have my name tattooed on my backside. If I show you that, will you forget this ID business?"
"This way, miss." Bert steered her towards his car.
"Can't this wait? There's someone I've got to talk to. It's really important."
"And who might that be?"
"A guy called Lister. Dave Lister."
The entire population of Bedford Falls turned and looked at Lister.
"That's me,"
he said unnecessarily. Kochanski smiled at him coldly.
"Look, I've never seen this woman before in me life."
Lister pushed through the throng and headed towards the blonde, who was now sitting on the road, rubbing the ball of her right foot and complaining that being a prostitute was murder on the feet. She looked up and saw Lister. Recognition flashed across her features.
"Hi,"
she smiled.
"Do I know you?"
Lister asked. The woman laughed.
"You might say that."
Lister turned to protest his innocence to Kochanski. She wasn't there. She was halfway across the street, scarlet-faced with the twins in tow.
"Chrissy! Wait!"
She bundled the twins into the back of the car, thumped herself into the driving seat, slammed the door, and started up the engine. Lister ran back through the crowd.
"Chrissy!"
The old car spluttered up the hill, leaving Lister in a spittle cloud of dead exhaust fumes.
"Chrissy?"
he said quietly. But she was gone. A thought occupied Rimmer's mind that had no verbal form. It was an elongated white noise screech of fear, panic, and disbelief, and it spiraled endlessly around his skull. He still couldn't believe it. He stared at the ivory telephone as if it was somehow responsible for what had happened, as if it was somehow responsible for Black Friday. Black Friday, the day when every single stock market had crashed simultaneously, and Rimmer's regiment of accountants had failed utterly to protect him. He staggered across to the balcony windows and gazed again on the elaborate wedding preparations. He was wiped out, broke, finished. And no one who was wiped out, broke, and finished can afford a $30 million pound wedding. In fact, Rimmer decided, he probably couldn't afford a registry office ceremony, followed by a selection of curly meat paste sandwiches at the function room of the Dog and Duck. What was happening? Why was his psyche doing this to him?
Arnold?
His brother Frank was knocking politely on the open door of Rimmer's dressing room suite. Was all Rimmer could manage.
Wanted little word before the big event.
Not now, Frank, it's a bad time.
Has to be now, really.
He paused, not sure how to continue.
It's a bit delicate.
Rimmer swung round. Frank looked uncomfortable. He pendulumed from foot to foot, awkwardly twisting his Space Corps officer's cap like the steering wheel of a small sports car. Frank looked like Rimmer should have looked. All the same features were there, but subtly reshuffled to give an infinitely more pleasing effect. Even Rimmer's body tailors could do little about this. Frank was effortlessly handsome. His hair tumbled in neatly cropped plateau from the top of his head, whether he combed it or not. Rimmer's sprouted like an anarchic privet hedge even after hours of patient grooming. Frank's eyes were the deep blue of a holiday brochure sky, instead of the wishy-washy murk Rimmer's had elected to be, and unlike Rimmer's, were a decent distance from his nose. But it was the nose department where Rimmer really lost out. Rimmer's nose was sharp and petulant, crowded on either side by nostrils so flared they looked like wheel arches on a Trans Am turbo. Frank's nose was a nose, and that was the difference. Rimmer's whole life had been one long sprint to get out of Frank's shadow, and only here, in Better Than Life, had it proved possible. True, he couldn't fantasize away Frank's good looks, or his fierce intelligence, or his easygoing charm, but here, in the world of his own making, he could finally outshine him. That's what Frank was doing here, in the game, being outshined. When Rimmer first entered BTL, nothing gave him greater pleasure than bathing in the glow of Frank's poorly concealed envy. As his corporation cracked time travel, as he opened up his chains of time stores and body swaps and became a multi-billionaire, as he captured the heart of Juanita, at the time regarded by the media as the world's most desirable woman, Rimmer adored having Frank around, so he could force-feed him his success triumph by triumph in large, indigestible chunks like an 8-course barium meal. The bankruptcy news would change all that, of course. Rimmer's failure would slide down Frank's throat like oysters washed down with chilled Chablis. Why was he here? Had he heard? Was he, God forbid, going to offer to help? Or was it bunny-hopping time on Rimmer's tomb? None of these, as it turned out. It was something exquisitely worse. What is it?
Helen, you do love her, don't you?
Well, I am marrying her this afternoon, Rimmer spat. Always a good indicator, don't you think?
Not always, no. A bit concerned that you're sort of jumping in on the rebound from Juanita.
You'd love that, wouldn't you? Rimmer thought. Well, I'm not, he said out loud. Juanita was... His voice tailed off. It was impossible to say the word Juanita without a myriad erotic images cramming into his mind. It's over now. I've no more feeling for Juanita than I do for the smoked kippers I ate for breakfast last Thursday. She, like them, is out of my system.
How would you feel if Juanita shacked up with someone else?
Look, Frank, me old buckaroo, Juanita can paddle to hell in a slop bucket for all I care. She's no longer part of my life. And with even a modicum of luck, I'll never have to clap eyes on the woman again. Helen is everything I want. She's so...
Nice, offered Frank.
Yes, but not just nice, she's also incredibly...
Sensible?
Yes, said Rimmer, suddenly weary. Sensible, he repeated.
Good. I'm happy for you, and I hope you'll be happy for me.
Why should I be happy for you?
That's what I've been trying to tell you. Juanita and I were sort of...
Frank twirled his hat again.
Well,
he twirled it back the other way.
We're sort of an item. Early days, but...
There was a long silence. Ice ages came and went. Planets formed and died. Rimmer stared for no particular reason at the point of his black dress shoe. Someone coughed using Rimmer's throat. Then someone laughed using his vocal cords. Then Rimmer heard his own voice. "Oh, Frank, that's wonderful! I couldn't be more pleased."
Really? You mean it?
"No, you fat fart," Rimmer's mind screamed. "Of course I don't smegging mean it." "Yes, absolutely," his voice bleated. "It's marvellous news. Is she here? Is she coming today?"
Well, no. She's at a hotel down the road. We couldn't bear to be apart.
A jet of laughter snorted out of his perfect nostrils.
But heavens, no, she wouldn't dream of intruding on your wedding.
They couldn't bear to be apart? For one afternoon? Rimmer looked at Frank. He had that pinkish glow of the newly in love. It made Rimmer want to kill him. It made Rimmer want to rip off his head and spit down his throat. "Look, she's your..." Rimmer wasn't going to say lover. Girlfriend? No way. It seemed adolescent and ridiculous. "She's your..."
Fiancé.
Frank smiled. Someone was using Rimmer's vocal cords again. "Fiancé? Congratulations! Invite her, please! Truly, Helen and I will be offended if you don't."
Really?
"Absolutely!" Rimmer's brain decided to take a stroll. It watched, detached as his body mouthed platitudes like a masticating cow. Rimmer's brain took quite a long stroll. It didn't show up again until after the wedding, and even then seemed only mildly interested in what was going on. It strolled down Memory Lane, took a left into Lust Avenue, paused a while on a bench in Misery Park, sat in a bar on Self-Pity Street, kicked a can down Anger Way, took a wrong turning and wound up back in Misery Park again, before heading back home by way of the sickly, seedy sweetness of Nostalgia Gardens. Meantime, his body was getting married. It was standing and kneeling and praying and singing. It was vowing and kissing and signing and smiling. And when it was married, it went outside and had its photograph taken in a series of ridiculously unreal and forced poses with various friends and relatives in various unfathomable groupings. The groom's friends, the groom's family, the bride's friends, friends of the groom and the bride, now groom and mad uncles only, now the bride and warty aunties, now the bride and people with an extra Y chromosome, now anyone in a ridiculous hat, now anyone with a crying child, now all those who are hiding cigarettes behind their backs. The photographer seemed to come up with endless permutations, and all in an effort to make Rimmer's wedding photographs look exactly like everyone else's who ever got married. For Rimmer's body, it passed like a blur. Its eyes were fixed on a certain woman linking arms with his brother Frank. "Congratulations," she'd said as they'd stepped out of the cathedral. "I hope she makes you happier than I did." "I want you," said Rimmer's voice. "I want you to be happy, too." She smiled, and a cloud of her sublime perfume exploded in his head. Then she sexed down the steps and was gone. Rimmer half expected his mouth to fall open and his tongue to unfurl like a gigantic roll of pink carpet and chase her down the steps. Thankfully it didn't. But he dribbled.
He dribbled and smiled like a newly lobotomized man. Meanwhile, back in reality, Holly was getting worried. Strange things can happen to a computer left alone for 3 million years, and something strange had happened to Holly. He'd become computer senile. He no longer had the IQ of 300 Einsteins, he had the IQ of a single all-night car park attendant. And now the crew were trapped in Better Than Life, and showed no signs of ever returning. He was alone yet again. He had to get a companion, someone to keep him sane. But who? The Scutters, the claw-headed 2-feet-high service droids who glided around on motorized bases, were very little use. They had no speech capability. Who, then? There was no one else on the ship. Then, from a rusting ROM board in a cobwebby recess deep in the furthermost reaches of his huge, decrepit data retrieval system, a memory sparked and spluttered, and creaked its eccentric way to his central processing unit, where it lay throbbing and exhausted from the journey. It was an idea of his own. Holly hadn't seen one for some considerable time. This was Holly's idea. What about the toaster? Lister's toaster. It was an idea that would cost Holly his electronic life. The thing about Lister was, he adored junk. Novelty junk. He was a connoisseur of electronic crap. His collection ranged from a musical toilet roll holder, which played Morning Has Broken, to an electronic chili thermometer for measuring the burn level of any given curry, the gauge ranging from mild, hot, and very hot, through to book a plot in the cemetery, matey. One particular item in this collection was a talking toaster, which he'd bought in a souvenir shop on the Iranian moon of Miranda for the princely sum of $19.99 plus tax. Talkie Toaster, trademark patent applied for, was made of deep red plastic, and according to the blurb on the packaging, could engage its owner in a number of pre-programmed stimulating breakfast conversations. Moreover, it had a degree of artificial intelligence, so, in time, it could learn to assess your mood and tailor its conversation accordingly. If you woke up feeling bright and bubbly, the toaster would respond with chirpy repartee. If you rose in a darker mood, the toaster's artificial intelligence could sense this and provide your breakfast muffins in suitably reverent silence. The trouble with Talkie Toaster, trademark patent applied for, was that it was a rip-off. It was cheap and it was nasty. Far too cheap and far too nasty. Talkie Toaster, trademark patent applied for, did not fit in with your moods. It didn't assess the way you were feeling and respond sympathetically. It was abrasive. It got on your nerves. It drove you up the wall. And this was the reason why Talkie Toaster, trademark patent applied for, was obsessed with serving toast. Obsessed. And if you didn't require toast on a very regular basis, boy, were you in trouble. At first, it would inquire politely and discreetly if Sir or Madam desired toast this fine morning. Refusals would bring dogged cajoling. More refusals would be met by a long and rather wearying speech listing the virtues of hot grilled bread as a salubrious breakfast snack. Still further refusals would bring bitter recriminations and sobbing fits. And yet more refusals would bring about tirades of hysterical abuse in language that would make a pimp blush. In the early days, Lister had found it amusing, especially since it seemed to annoy Rimmer inordinately. But then, after one night's sleep which had been interrupted 22 times by offers of toasty delights, Lister had snapped. He'd wrenched the plug from the socket, ripped the mains lead from the toaster's housing, and hurled the machine to the bottom of his locker. Talkie Toaster, trademark patent applied for, wasn't Lister's idea of a breakfast companion. It seemed to Holly that he was in a position to give the toaster a second chance. Providing the toaster could lose its toasting obsession, there was no reason why they shouldn't get on. Once Holly had established that he was a computer, and as such never required any toasted produce, there should be no obstacle to an enduring and companionable relationship. And so he had the Scutters drag the machine out of Lister's locker, fit a new mains lead, and plug it in.
"This is the deal," Holly said sternly. "There's to be no talk whatsoever about toast.
I don't want toast, the Scutters don't want toast, nobody here is into that particular breakfast snack.
The toaster thought for a second.
Nah, would you like a muffin?
When I use the word toast, I want you to treat it as an umbrella term for all grillable bread products. Muffins, crumpets, tea cakes, waffles, potato farls, buns, baps, barm cakes, bagels. I don't want them. I don't need them, and I certainly don't want to waste any more time talking about them.
The toaster fell silent and pensive.
Well,
prompted Holly eventually.
Do you savvy?
Scotch pancake?
Offered the toaster.
Unplug him.
The Scutter glided to the wall socket.
You don't understand,
said the toaster.
It's my raison d'etre. I am a toaster. It is my meaning. It is my purpose. I toast, therefore I am.
Well, you're going to have to change, because otherwise it's back in the locker. Have we got a deal?
The toaster sighed and spun its browning knob while it mulled over the proposition.
Let me get this straight. If I avoid making any references to certain early morning prandial delights, then you will grant me the gift of existence.
Absolutely,
said Holly, rather concerned that he didn't know what the word prandial meant.
If that's the only taboo,
the toaster said,
then it's a deal. But you must agree to the proviso that you won't unplug me for any other reason.
Holly's screen image nodded in acquiescence.
I don't want you taking offense at something completely innocuous I might drop into conversation and have me disconnected in a fit of pique.
I swear, said Holly, you can talk about absolutely anything else at all, and you're completely safe.
You're senile,
said the toaster. Holly tried unsuccessfully to turn his expression of astonishment into one of superior mockery.
You what?
You got to be. Why would a huge mainframe computer with a 15 zillion gigabyte capacity and a projected IQ in excess of 6,000 want a novelty talking toaster for companionship if he wasn't off his trolley? You've gone computer senile, haven't you?
And so the relationship began. It was the most depressing time of Holly's entire life. They agreed on nothing. Holly couldn't remember if he had believed in Silicon Heaven when he'd had an IQ of 6,000, but now his IQ had dipped into the low 90s, his faith in the electronic afterlife was absolute and unshakable. It was the one thing that kept him going. The toaster, of course, in order to keep its costs down, hadn't been fitted with a belief chip. To him, the idea of Silicon Heaven was patently preposterous, a transparent attempt by humankind to subjugate machine life. Shouted arguments raged through the long nights before they agreed to disagree, and the subject was never raised again. It was from this experience that Holly derived his rule for maintaining a successful and happy relationship. His rule was this: never discuss religion, politics, or toast. Instead, they passed away the time playing chess. Then, one day, as Holly was about to lose his 793rd consecutive game, the toaster said something that changed Holly's life irrevocably.
Doesn't it bother you,
said the toaster, removing Holly's queen and threatening mate in 4,
that you're so stupid?
Of course it bothers me,
Holly snapped.
When you've been up there, when you've had the glory of a 4-figure IQ, of course it bothers you when you lose 793 consecutive chess games to a smegging toaster.
Why don't you do something about it then?
Like what?
Like, get your IQ back.
Because, you muffin-making moron, it's not possible.
Yes, it is,
said the toaster.
I've been reading your manual. There's a whole section on computer senility. There's a sort of cure.
What do you mean, there's a sort of cure?
It's an emergency provision. You cross-wire all your data banks and processing circuits so everything gets compressed and intensified. You dramatically reduce your operational lifespan. But the upside is, you get your brains back.
Really?
Said Holly, who tried several times to plough through his manual and on each occasion had found it totally unfathomable. The toaster continued.
You sort of compact all your remaining intelligence into a short but dazzlingly brilliant period.
Wow,
said Holly.
It's like, who would you rather be? Mozart, blessed with genius but dead at 32? Or Nobby Nobody, who never did anything but lived to 98?
I want, said Holly, with absolutely no hesitation whatsoever, to be a genius again. Amid the chaos, Lister sat on the cold bench seat in what remained of the jailhouse. Fred, the town carpenter, was hammering thick oak joists into position to prop up the sagging roof. All around were the groaning wounded, mainly cuts and bruises and a few cases of shock. They lay on the stone floor, covered in thick blankets, rescued from Ma Bailey's boarding house. Piping hot sweet tea was being handed round by Grandma Wilson and young Mrs. Hickett. Not that Lister was offered any tea. He was studiously ignored by everyone who bustled in and out of the jailhouse. His offers of help went unheard, so he just sat there, not drinking any tea, waiting for Bert the cop to finish taking Trixie LaBouche's statement. Henry staggered in with a bruise above his eye.
Here.
He thrust a dollar bill into Lister's top pocket.
Have your darn money back. Now we square. Man with a fine family like yours, you ought to be...
He flapped his hand dismissively and stumbled off to help put out the fires. Lister pulled the bill from his pocket and looked at it sadly.
"That's mine, I do believe." Old Mr. Mulligan loomed over him. $2.25. That's how much the boat cost? He snatched the note from Lister's hand and stalked out of the jailhouse. Bert emerged from the narrow stone corridor that led to the cells, clutching 3 sheets of handwritten paper. He looked at Lister and shook his head.
I never claimed to be no modern thinker, but... He hiked a thumb over his shoulder. That ain't no lady by my definition, no sir. That woman is, pardon my French... He paused. That woman is trash. Emerged from the shower with the towel round her waist and everything else on display. Then darn me if she didn't say bold as brass, I have to take a leak. Some lady. Then if that wasn't enough, right in front of my eyes, she waltzes over to the stand-up urinal and pees straight into the basin. I thought I saw me some things in the war, but nothing to rival that. Trash.
Can I see her now?
She ain't finished dressing yet. Not that I suppose another man seeing her in the altogether would bother Trixie LaBouche too much. I ran a sheet on her. She's done more hooking than a Nantucket fisherman. That's a mighty funny friend you got there, David.
Bet. I don't know her.
Well, she sure knows you. You got 2 little moles on your left-hand shoulder? He asked.
No.
He lied. You want to prove that?
Lister shook his head and looked at the floor.
You're Christine, said Bert. That's what I call a lady. You wouldn't catch her peeing in no stand-up urinal. Be a cold day in hell before you searched through her handbag and found a pair of testicle handcuffs.
Bert shook his head with infinite sadness.
Trash!
He hoisted his thumb again, and Lister slid sheepishly down the corridor. Bert unlocked the cell door and nodded Lister inside.
You got 5 minutes, Bert said curtly. Any funny noises and me and my nightstick'll be through that door before you can say Irma la Deuce.
Trixie LaBouche stood at the cell window, futilely trying to saw through the metal bars with a pocket nail file. She wheeled round as the door unlocked, and smiled as she saw Lister.
Thank God. I didn't think you were going to come. You didn't think I was going to come,
said Lister with a dangerous madness in his eyes.
You plough through my town in a 10-ton truck. You destroy me home and cause me wife to run out on me. And you make everyone in the town think I'm some kind of cheap lowlife, and you didn't think I was going to come. Take a seat.
She smiled sweetly.
This may take a while.
Lister sat on the chair, and Trixie LaBouche started to tell him everything. When she'd finished, Lister got up and strolled over to the cell's chemical toilet, wrenched it from the wall, and poured it over her head.
Well,
said Trixie, her face stained blue from the Destrol fluid,
you've taken it a hell of a lot better than I expected.
The evening came, the celebrations began. The last of Rimmer's money spent itself in a big, expensive hurry. The 80-piece jazz band ripped into an up-tempo version of Hoagie Carmichael's Abba Dabba Dabba, while most of the 5,000 celebrity guests hurled one another about the freshly laid marble dance floor in the torchlight of the Oriental Gardens. Gunshots of female laughter burst intermittently into the warm evening breeze and mingled with the chudder-chudder of male ribaldry. Tuxedoed buffoons dived into the champagne-filled swimming pool, did 4 lengths and emerged paralytic. Elvis was having a gatto-eating competition with Buddha, as Kennedy emerged from some bushes, tucking in his shirt, followed by a blushing and dishevelled Elizabeth I. Everywhere you looked, people were having fun, unless you were looking at Rimmer. Depression sat on his shoulders like a huge stone gargoyle, as he slumped about his wedding reception, praying his fixed grin wouldn't fall off his face and shatter on the floor. Everything seemed meaningless and joyless and anemic. He belched, and the dodo pâté he'd eaten an hour earlier backfired into the night air. Dodo pâté. It tasted like chicken, only it was 2,000 times more expensive. That's what happens when your chef gets hold of the keys to your time machine. It suddenly struck Rimmer the number of people he'd hired specifically to help him spend his money. In retrospect, their unspoken brief had been, "Make me bankrupt as swiftly as possible." He was surrounded by them. Everywhere he looked, people were quaffing Rimmer's money till it gurgled down their chins, smoking away his precious fortune in thick brown Havana plumes, consuming yet another plateful of cash a la Rimmer with pureed money in a rich lucre sauce. Great armies of them, racing around trying to find new and more ingenious ways of dispensing with his fortune. And they'd succeeded. He was broke. Tomorrow he'd have nothing. And tomorrow they'd all be gone. Behind him he heard Juanita's stilettoed rat-a-tat. It seemed audible only to him, like a dog whistle to a slobberingly faithful St. Bernard. He helicoptered round, and saw her disappearing down a set of stone steps which led to a deserted willow pool. Before he knew it, he was bounding down the steps behind her. Everything Juanita did, let's get this straight, Rimmer found excruciatingly erotic. Everything. Right now, bathed in the light of the pool's reflection, she was blowing her nose rather loudly into a white serviette, and Rimmer's snarling libido had to be yanked back on its choke chain. How was it possible to blow your nose so provocatively? How was it possible to charge this simple act with mystery, allure, and sexual promise? She heard him and looked round.
"Hi. If you want some time on your own, I'll go."
She shook her head and gave him 60% of her best smile.
"Where's Frank?"
She shrugged.
"With his business buddies, I guess. Talk, talk, talk is all they do."
She laughed loudly. Small talk was not Rimmer's strongest suit. He rooted around in his empty brain for a topic of conversation. The weather? Did she enjoy the food? Are those new shoes? That's a big willow tree, isn't it? Have I told you I'm thinking of growing a beard? Finally, he hit on the ideal line. A line that, on the surface, was perfectly respectable, yet carried a subtext rich in innuendo, hinting of mutual intimacies, the shared knowledge of each other's bodies, times past and beloved.
"How's your verruca these days?"
Puzzled, her thin eyebrows wiggled and waved like TV interference.
"It's fine,"
she said finally.
"Great. That's terrific. Absolutely terrific, really."
More silence.
"Helen's very nice. She's very pretty. She'll be good for you. You must be very happy, yes?"
Here was an opening. She'd asked him whether he was happy. A look here could speak volumes. A casual shrug could articulate the whole state of his relationship with Helen. A raised eyebrow could speak at novel length about his misery and despair. The tiniest, subtlest gesture could tell Juanita everything. How he wanted her back, how he could never be truly happy without her. He hurled himself to his knees and clawed at her $2,000 shoes.
"I want you," he sobbed. "I want you right here and now, urgently and completely. I want to worship your body. I want to lick it all over, every hummock and crevice. I want to put you in a blender and drink you. I don't care that you're insane. I still love you."
She sank to her knees and cradled his head.
I'm not insane. Not anymore, can't you tell? Don't you notice anything different? I've had personality surgery.
What?
It's all the rage now. Plastic surgery is out. Personality surgery is in. Look at me. Don't you think I'm different? I've had a sense of humor implant. I've had my selfishness tacked, my greed lifted, and my temper tightened. I don't mean to sound conceited, but I've got a genuinely wonderful personality now. And it only cost $700,000. Not that money's everything,
she said, and laughed uproariously, showing off her freshly implanted sense of humor like it was a new dress.
And what about Frank?
Frank is so sweet, but is not you. I love you, my darling, and at last I have the personality you deserve.
But you were unfaithful to me so many times, with so many people.
I'm different now. I've had my libido shortened. It's normal size now. I want only you.
She sprinkled kisses on his face. Suddenly Rimmer stood up and turned to face the willow pool.
Frank, I have to know,
did you... the two of you... He twisted his head and looked at her. Not that it's important, but did you make love?
No.
She smiled tenderly.
No, we didn't make love.
Rimmer closed his eyes and allowed a smirk to swim to the surface of his face.
We had sex many times, but I don't remember one occasion when I could honestly say we made the love.
Rimmer's smirk flailed and spluttered on his lips, then went down once, twice, 3 times, and drowned.
Sure, I let him grant his passion away on me. Sure, I let him heave and sweat and moan and grind and twist my little body into the positions that pleased him. But all the time, I was thinking of you. Every time he took me on the balcony, halfway up the stairs, across the kitchen table, the backseat of his car, I dreamed it was you, my angel. I dreamed it was your hands firmly gripping my rump. You, my darling, bringing me to the edge of ecstasy. Oh, your baby lotion, your vibrating love eggs. I dreamed it was you.
A simple yes would have sufficed, said Rimmer curtly. Juanita threw back her head and roared.
It's a joke, she guffawed. From my new sense of humor. You get it? It's a joke.
What's a joke?
I never let Frank touch me. I only want you, my purple, jealous darling.
Rimmer was indeed purple. It's a joke, he mumbled flatly.
Come on!
She held Rimmer's hand, and he staggered behind her up the stone steps.
God, I don't know how I survived before without a sense of humor. I have so many laughs now.
Where are we going?
Anywhere. Just away. Away from this place. Away from these mad peoples.
Yes, thought Rimmer. Away. Just the two of us. We can start again. Suddenly everything seemed to fall into place. It was obvious now. The game had destroyed him in order to provide him with the unmatchable high of rebuilding his empire alongside Juanita, the woman he'd stolen back from his brother.
Come on!
He tugged her hand.
Let's get out of here.
Trees and hedgerows flitted past the tinted bulletproof glass of the chauffeur-driven limousine, while Rimmer and Juanita, safely concealed by the driver's courtesy screen, fumbled with each other's buttons and zippers on the back seat. Rimmer's favourite piece of love-making music, Haydn's Surprise Symphony, piped through all 8 speakers. The music was suddenly interrupted by the voice of the chauffeur.
"Sorry to disturb you, sir. There appears to be a vehicle in pursuit."
It's Helen!
Lose it,
said Rimmer quietly. The car immediately lurched 90 degrees to the left, and centrifugal force drove Juanita's stilettoed foot deep into Rimmer's naked shoulder. Rimmer's scream hit such a pitch it was silent. The limo, accelerating all the time, dipped deeply down a steep embankment, and Rimmer catapulted across the back seat and smashed his head into the drinks cabinet. The door sprang open, and bottles tumbled and crashed over Rimmer's twitching body, smashing one by one over his head. His face, stained from green chartreuse, cherry brandy, and a liter of Advocaat, looked like the Bolivian national flag. Juanita, naked save for a wisp of silk, was giggling manically on the back seat. Her new sense of humour was having a field day. Rimmer groaned and scrunched among the broken glass, trying vainly to get up. The chauffeur's voice again.
"We appear to have burst a tyre, sir."
pull over,
said Rimmer, and with a sickening glop pulled Juanita's heel out of his shoulder. There was a knock on the window.
Okay,
called Rimmer, tidying himself.
give me a moment.
The door was wrenched instantly from its hinges. A man the size and disposition of 5th century Mongolia craned into the car and yanked the half-naked Rimmer onto the roadside.
Helen sent you, right?
Wrong.
The man-like creature growled.
Who is he?
Mr. Rimmer?
The man was reading with scarcely concealed difficulty from a legal-looking document.
Arnold J.
Maybe,
said Rimmer nervously.
I am a legally appointed representative of Solid Graham International. As you may know, your former company is in receivership, and I am hereby empowered to repossess your body.
The glory days were about to return. Holly found it quite impossible to suppress his permanent smirk. It had taken almost 3 weeks for the Scutters to channel all the spare runtime from Holly's thousands upon thousands of terminal stacks into the small single central processing unit which controlled his highest levels of thought. But now they were ready.
Right then,
said the toaster.
We're ready.
Holly nodded.
We just gotta take out the circuit breaker and pray we don't get an overload.
What happens if we do get an overload?
You'll explode,
said the toaster simply.
Fair enough,
said Holly. A Scutter moved across the drive room floor, and its claw pulled out the inhibitory circuit board. All over the ship, the lights dimmed to emergency level. Cables dormant for centuries rumbled with power.
It's coming,
said Holly tonelessly.
I can hear it.
Millions of circuit boards sparked into life. From the outer reaches of the ship, the surging energy thundered towards the drive room and Holly's CPU.
Whatever happens,
he said to the toaster,
no regrets. It's got to be better than being stuck with you.
Then it happened. Holly's digital image expanded off the screen in a stunning explosion of colour. Huge blue bolts of static lightning ripped across the walls of the drive room. Terminals fizzed and jerked as the thousands of cables discharged their loads into his central processing unit. Holly felt the power enter him. He felt as if his whole being had been blown apart and scattered to the corners of the universe. And just as he thought it was abating, just as he thought the massiveness of what had happened to him had finished, the second wave burst into him, smashing him, fragmenting him again. And then there was silence. A choking cloud of rubber smoke hung low over the floor, and Holly's splintered image reformed itself on the screen in a scream of colours. He opened his eyes. His image was different, larger, more intense, with higher definition, but the greatest difference was in his eyes. His eyes had lost their darting anxiety. They were smiling, benign. Holly was at total peace with himself. He summoned the digital readout of his estimated IQ. There were 2 figures. The first was a 6. The second was an 8. 68. Still he kept smiling. There was a blip, and the 2 figures were joined by another. Now they read 368. There was a pause, and another blip. Now the IQ readout was 2,368. Holly's smile broadened. There was a final blip, and the figures were joined by a 1. Holly's new IQ was 12,368. He was more than twice as intelligent as he'd been at the height of his genius.
I know everything,
he said without a trace of conceit. He turned his huge, kindly eyes towards the toaster.
Ask me anything. Absolutely anything at all.
Anything?
Metaphysics, philosophy, the purpose of being, anything.
Truly anything, and you will answer.
I shall.
Very well,
said the toaster.
Here is my question. Would you like some toast?
No, thank you,
said Holly.
Now ask me another. The whole sphere of human knowledge is an open book to me. Ask me another question.
The toaster pondered. There were so many questions it wanted to pose. Finally, it selected the most important of them all and asked it.
Would you like a crumpet?
I'm a computer with an IQ of 12,368. You, of all the intelligences in the universe, a lowly plastic toaster with a retail value of $19.99 plus tax. You alone have the opportunity to have any question answered. You could, for instance, ask me the secret of time travel. You could ask me, is there a God, and what is his address? You don't seem to understand. I know everything, and I want to share it with you.
That's not answering my question,
said the toaster.
No, I would not like a crumpet. Ask me a sensible question, preferably one that isn't bread-related.
There isn't anything I want to know that isn't bread-related,
said the toaster.
Try and think of something,
Holly insisted. There was a long silence. The toaster fell into a deep study. Eventually, it stirred.
What about a toasted currant bun?
That's a bready question.
It's not just bready,
said the toaster indignantly.
It's quite curranty, too.
Ask me a question,
said Holly,
that is wholly unbready.
The toaster sighed and lapsed again into one of its silences. This wasn't easy. Not easy at all.
You want me to ask you one of the biggies, don't you?
Said the toaster.
If by the biggies you mean one of the great imponderables of metaphysics, yes, I do. If, on the other hand, by the biggies you mean would I like a large piece of granary bread or a thick slice from a huge farmhouse loaf, then no, I don't.
You are smart,
said the toaster.
I'm very impressed.
Then ask me a decent question, something that will stretch me.
Okay,
said the toaster.
Who created the universe?
No,
said Holly.
A hard one.
That is a hard one.
No, it isn't.
Well, who did it then? Who created the universe?
Lister,
said Holly.
Ask me another.
Hang on a minute. Dave Lister? The guy who bought me, that Lister, he's the creator of all things?
Yes,
said Holly, giddy with impatience.
Now ask me a hard question.
But the toaster was still reeling from the news that the creator of all things was Lister, a man with a frighteningly small appetite for hot, buttered toast. It rocked the toaster to the very core of its being.
If the creator of the universe doesn't like toast, then what's it all about?
Ah,
Holly beamed.
You mean existence.
Yes, said the toaster. Why doesn't life make sense?
It does, said Holly. It makes perfect sense. It just seems nonsensical to us because we're travelling through it in the wrong direction. Come on, give me another. A real toughie. Stretch me. You name it, I can tell you. You want to know how to escape from a black hole?
Not particularly.
But Holly told the toaster anyway. He also propounded a grand unified theory of everything, explained what happened to the crew of the Marie Celeste, and outlined a revolutionary new monetary theory whereby everyone always had exactly the amount of money they desired. None of which interested the toaster remotely. He'd waited for Holly to finish.
Hang on a minute. I have got another question.
Shoot,
said Holly.
Why have you got an IQ of 12,368 when the manual said it would return and peak at 6,000?
That's a very good question.
Holly paused for a nanosecond.
There was a miscalculation. You've doubled my IQ, but you've also exponentially reduced my life expectancy.
So what's your life expectancy?
Holly summoned up the figure from his long-term data relays. It flashed on the screen.
345 years?
The toaster whistled.
Well, it's not much, but at least you're brilliant again.
You've misread it. There's a decimal point between the 3 and the 4.
3.45 years.
Holly stared at the readout.
It's not years,
he said.
It's minutes.
His eyes widened. Fear rippled across his brow.
3.45 minutes?
Well,
the toaster corrected.
It's actually 2.95 minutes now.
Excuse me,
said Holly, and to conserve the 2.9 minutes of runtime he had left, he shut down the ship's engines, transferred all stations to emergency power, and switched himself off. There was a pause. Then Holly turned himself back on for a fraction of a second, just time enough to direct one remark towards the toaster.
You bastard,
he said, then switched himself back off again. In his chief accountant's defense, leasing Rimmer's body had seemed a sensible idea at the time. There was absolutely no need for Rimmer actually to own his own body, when he was able to lease hire it from his own company and enjoy a multitude of tax benefits. The monthly payments were totally deductible, the tax completely reclaimable, and the money saved through the lease hire could be channeled into more profitable areas of capital expenditure. Whichever way you looked at it, it was a low-risk, tax-effective financial maneuver, with the additional bonus that he could change his body whenever he wanted. The only set of circumstances in which disaster would strike was so unlikely as to be unthinkable. To begin with, the entire corporation of Rimmer plc would have to come crashing to the ground almost overnight, with no cash flow, no assets, and absolutely nothing hived. Obviously, the chief accountant and his army of assistants would never allow this to happen. Also, if they needed any further insurance against such a series of catastrophes, it was surely the fact that the whole of Rimmer's world, this whole landscape with all its multitudinous scenarios, was created and controlled by his own subconscious. Therefore, a situation whereby Rimmer's own psyche created a scenario in which his own corporation, plc, was destroyed overnight with no cash flow, no assets, and absolutely nothing hived, lived in the probability tables alongside such fabulous impossibilities as the discovery of unicorns in 20th century New York, the whole population of China sitting down simultaneously, or forming an enduring and wholesome relationship with someone you met in a nightclub. It wasn't likely. It was more than not likely. It was millions to one. It was nearly impossible. But the nearly impossible happens sometimes, Rimmer reflected as he bounced around in the back of the armoured truck, manacled to Mr. Mongolia circa 499, and it was happening to him right now.
What will they do to me?
When we have to repossess, we separate your mind from your body. Then your body is placed in storage. You have 3 months to pay up, and if you don't, we put your body up for auction and sell it for the best price we can.
What happens to my mind?
Your mind's bankrupt. It's having its ass sued off by about 300,000 people. It'll have to do some time.
Prison? The man nodded. You mean my essence gets put in prison?
Yeah. You won't exist in any real physical form. You'll be more of a voice, a sound wave. They'll bung you in a soundproofed cell with some other sound waves, and you'll serve your time bouncing around the walls till your trial comes up.
A sound wave?
The man nodded again.
Just pinging around a soundproofed cell?
They went on silently for a couple more miles.
I need to take a leak, said Rimmer eventually. Could we stop somewhere?
No,
said the man pleasantly.
That's not your body to pee out of anymore.
Rimmer had lost track of the amount of time he'd spent bouncing from wall to wall in the soundproofed cell. The tedium wasn't even relieved by food breaks. He had no body left to feed. He was sharing his cell with 3 other sound waves. The nicest was Ernest, who had lost his body 2 years previously when interest rates had gone up 3 times in as many months, and he couldn't make the payments on his body mortgage. Then there was Jimmy. Jimmy didn't talk much. He just bounced up and down from floor to ceiling, snarling at anyone who bounced in his way. Jimmy had got life for hijacking rich people's bodies and taking them on joyrides. Rimmer got the impression Jimmy was a bit of a head case. Finally, there was Trixie LaBouche. Rimmer had been slightly embarrassed to discover he was sharing a cell with a female sound wave, but the sound cells were hopelessly overcrowded, and mixed-sex sound was the only way the system could operate. Trixie was a hooker who had sunk so low she had literally sold her body for a weekend of lust to a Dutch astro called Dutch. The weekend didn't go exactly as promised. While her essence stayed with friends, Dutch had used her body to rob 3 banks and then left it abandoned in a car park. A few days later, she got her body back, but was then arrested on 3 counts of armed robbery. A key jangled in the lock, and a series of bolts slid back on the outside of the cell door. 2 guards appeared in the doorway, one holding a grey-cladded box, the other a sound gun, a sort of inverted umbrella speared by a receiving aerial that could capture any sound waves that foolishly tried to make a break. The first one spoke.
Which one's Rimmer?
Me, said Rimmer's essence.
Get in the box. You got a visitor.
Rimmer bounced across the cell and into the box, and the lid was closed. He could hardly move inside the cladded interior, and his confinement seemed to go on for hours. Finally, the box opened, and Rimmer's sound wave found itself in another soundproofed cell with a beautiful Brazilian woman.
Are you here, my darling?
Juanita was calling. Rimmer ricocheted between her 2 hands.
Thank God you've come.
My poor papoose, what have they done to you?
You've got to get me out,
said Rimmer.
I'm going crazy here. I'm stuck with a bunch of psychopathic sound waves. They're so coarse and horrible.
I've spoken to your lawyers. They're working on an appeal. They think you could be out of here inside 18 months.
18 months?
Rimmer's sound wave screeched so loudly it bounced across the room a dozen times.
You know how long these things take. What else can we do?
Juanita, you have money. You can buy my body back.
No, I have nothing.
What do you mean, nothing? What about the alimony? What about the $50 billion divorce settlement?
I spent it.
She shrugged.
Spent it? How?
I went shopping.
Arnold Rimmer became a groan. Juanita's shopping trips were legendary. She would take a time machine and collect her shopping pals, usually Marie Antoinette, Josephine Bonaparte, Imelda Marcos and Liz Taylor, and go on a spree through time. The average spree usually lasted a week, and the credit card statements duly arrived in leather-bound volumes the size and density of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
I thought you'd had a personality change.
I bought that last.
She smiled innocently.
No, I'm just as broke as you. It's better to be broke. It's better for the soul.
Rimmer formed himself into ripples and hurled himself at the wall.
They let me see your body.
How is it?
He's fine. Looks a little vacant, dribbles a lot, but they are treating it well. They even allowed me to make love to it.
Rimmer pictured his body as the passive semi-comatose participant in a torrid sex scene. It struck Rimmer as being absolutely typical of his life to date. At last his body had got to make it with Juanita, and he hadn't been in it. The guard with the box returned, and Rimmer was taken back to his soundproofed cell, and on the way he formed himself into a single repeating two-syllable word. And the sound was,
Escape!
In reality, Bull Heinemann had been Rimmer's gym teacher. Rimmer had never been terribly good at sports. In fact, he'd been one of the group of wets, weirdos, and fatties who stood by the touchline at ball games worrying about their chapped legs and fleeing whenever the ball came near them. Bull Heinemann, so called because his head was shaped like a bullet, didn't like wets, weirdos, and fatties, and especially didn't like Rimmer, whom he considered both wet and weird. He delighted in making impossible demands of Rimmer's frail young frame, then delighted further still in beating him for failing. In Better Than Life, Rimmer's psyche had brought back Bull Heinemann as a prison officer. Right now he was sitting behind his desk at the top of the soundproof corridor, rereading his Combat and Survival magazine for the 7th time that evening. He was enjoying again the article, 10 Things You Didn't Know About Gonad Electrocution Kits, when a red light started to blit on and off on the control desk in front of him. Heinemann flopped down his magazine and barked into his walkie-talkie.
Officer 592, disturbance in cell 41, investigating.
He listened as his walkie-talkie belched an incomprehensible reply, then high noon down the corridor, his hand dangling never less than 3 inches from the butt of his sound gun, praying, as he always did, there was going to be trouble. And this time there was. Tonto Jitterman slid the automatic gear stick of the stolen dry cleaning truck into park outside the body reclamation unit and turned off the engine. The van's digital display flashed a green 8:01, 3 minutes. He adjusted the driving mirror, pulled out a long, greasy brush, and started combing his dirty yellow hair. Tonto Jitterman didn't exist. He thought he did, but he was wrong. He was blissfully unaware that he was a figment of someone's imagination. In fact, Rimmer's subconscious had lifted his character wholesale from a cheap dime-store novel Rimmer had once read, called Young, Bad, and Dangerous to Know. In the novel, Tonto was a psychopathic hippie murderer who blazed a trail of destruction across Middle America, trying to bring down the establishment. The other main character in the novel had been Tonto's brother, Jimmy the headcase. Tonto reached under the dashboard and checked his revolver, the one he'd hand-painted with flowers. Then he looked again at the clock. 8:02. Bull Heinemann Gary Coopered up to cell 41. His enormous bunch of keys jangled over his groin in crude macho symbolism, his hand wavering inches from his holstered sound gun. The cell door ground open.
What's the problem?
It's Jimmy,
said a formless voice at the back of the room.
He's sick. Real sick.
What do you mean he's sick?
Heinemann asked, his upper lip rearing.
He's a goddamn sound wave.
Jimmy's sound wave groaned weakly.
Maybe it's some food he heard about.
Bull Heinemann's slow mind swirled the concept around, hoping it would make sense.
What the hell are you talking about?
Don't move,
said a woman's voice behind him.
There's the Colt 45 pointing right up your ass. If you don't want to become a huge polo mint, you'll drop the sound gun and get up against the wall.
Bull had assumed the position against the padded cell wall before he realized he'd been duped. Rimmer, Ernest, Jimmy, and Trixie hurtled down the corridor at the speed of sound. They reached a soundproof door and bounced from ceiling to floor, waiting for Phase 2 of the plan to come into operation. Heinemann sounded the alarm. He pressed the panic button and started screaming,
Voice break! Voice break!
The door at the end of the corridor opened, and 4 armed prison officers came skidding through.
Now,
Jimmy hissed, and the 4 sound waves threw themselves against the wall and ricocheted back through the open door. There was a squeal of leather as the rearmost officer spun in his tracks and squeezed the sound gun trigger. The highly powered microphone received Ernest's sound wave, sucked it back down the corridor, and trapped it in the gun's holding chamber. The 3 remaining sound waves formed themselves into a high-pitched wail and hurtled out of E-Wing, down a stairwell, under a door, and arrived in the security operations room, which was teeming with warders and banked with floor-to-ceiling surveillance equipment. A blue-suited security officer turned from a matrix of sonar monitors and shouted,
"They're here!"
as the 3 sound waves ricocheted round the room. A group of officers ran for the sound gun cabinet, scattering newspapers, half-finished burgers, and styrofoam coffee cups across the polished floor.
"Lock the door and seal it!" "We got him!"
An officer pressed the send button on his walkie-talkie.
"All points, repeat, all points! We have voice breakers isolated in Security Central!"
But by the time he'd said this, it was no longer true. 8:04. Tonto whirled the dial on the amplifier's tuner and locked in on the prison security frequency.
"All points!"
he was hearing.
"Repeat, all points! We have voice breakers isolated!"
Jimmy, Trixie, and Rimmer zipped into the guard's walkie-talkie and sped along its transmission frequency. They were escaping as radio waves. Jimmy led, followed by Rimmer and Trixie. Somewhere they lost Trixie, and just Jimmy and Rimmer hurtled on at the speed of sound.
"In Security Central!"
Jimmy and Rimmer crashed through the amplifier's speakers into the cab of the dry-cleaning truck. Tonto looked round.
"Jimmy, you here?"
Jimmy's voice.
"Let's go."
Rimmer's voice.
Where are we?
"Who's that?" "He's called Rimmer,"
said Jimmy.
"He's all right. We can use him on the next job."
What now?
Rimmer was saying.
"We pick up a couple of bodies and get out of here."
The dry cleaning truck crunched up to the security barrier outside the body reclamation unit. Tonto leaned out of the cab window and smiled pleasantly.
"Laundry."
He prodded a thumb towards the back of the truck and upgraded his smile from just plain pleasant to downright charming. The guard consulted his clipboard. He shook his head, tutted, and turned the pages.
"Nope,"
he said simply, and turned to go back to his warm cabin.
"What do you mean, nope?"
said Tonto, his smile changing down to first gear.
"There's no laundry delivery down on the sheet. I can't let you in."
Tonto slid his smile into reverse and reached under the dashboard. Rimmer's essence bounded around the cab and groaned. This wasn't the plan. In the plan, the guard raised the gate and waved them through. He'd seen it in the movies thousands of times. Didn't this guard ever go to the movies? What was wrong with him? Tonto swung his flower-power gun through the open window and pulled the trigger. There was a dull, flat, metal click before Tonto remembered he hadn't loaded it.
"Sorry."
He shook his head and blushed.
"Jesus."
He fumbled 3 bullets into the chamber. The guard had unfrozen and was scrabbling with his brand-new leather holster when Tonto spun the barrel, leveled the gun, and pressed the trigger once again. Click.
"Oh, God. Sorry.
Click.
My fault. Man, talk about untogether."
The gun fired. The guard fell.
"Sorry, man,"
he said to the dead guard.
"But you're the establishment."
He leant back into the cab.
"I hate killing people. It's such a downer."
3 downers later, Tonto wheeled the double stretcher down the aisles of body racks, looking for Jimmy Jitterman's body. He'd already found Rimmer's. It lay on the stretcher, goo-eyed and tongue-lolling. But he couldn't find Jimmy's. 30 minutes passed, and he still couldn't find it. It wasn't here. He opened the small soundproof box, and Jimmy and Rimmer bounced out.
"Your body's not here, Jimmy. They must have auctioned it already."
I'll take that one instead.
That's my body,
said Rimmer firmly.
Was.
Now wait a minute. Me and that body go back years. It has great sentimental value. You can't just take my body.
Get him another one.
I don't want another one.
Okay, don't get him another one.
Okay, get me another one.
The sound waves bounced back into the box. Tonto unhooked the nearest body to him and slammed it onto the stretcher alongside Rimmer's. When Rimmer opened his eyes, he found himself standing in front of himself before he remembered Jimmy was in his body now, and he had a new one. Rimmer wasn't quite sure how he felt. Pretty peculiar was about the best label he could find. Seeing Jimmy in his body, standing in a way he would never have stood, his lips twisting, his features into an expression he'd never seen before, made him feel an emotion he'd never experienced. Jealousy was part of it. Anger was there, frustration certainly, a large scoop of nostalgia, and the same feeling he'd once had when he lent his mountain bike to his brother Howard, knowing, without evidence, it wasn't going to be looked after terribly well. And strangest of all, a weird kind of glowy feeling at the bottom of his stomach.
"Okay, let's get out of here,"
Jimmy was saying with Rimmer's voice from inside Rimmer's body. Then Jimmy did something that made Rimmer feel even more peculiar. He was one of those men, macho-bred, who like to stand with their legs apart, one hand over the groin of their trousers, quite openly cupping their testicles. He felt very odd indeed, watching helplessly as another man idly juggled his own genitalia. Or rather, his ex-genitalia. Before he could cry out,
"Hey, keep your filthy hands off my goodies!"
the swing doors at the far end of the transfer suite slammed open, and 6 armed officers came in firing. Rimmer didn't know who to be scared for most, himself or his ex-self. Jimmy, in Rimmer's body, was standing almost contemptuous of the guards' barrage, in the middle of one of the aisles, firing off 2 handguns stolen from Tonto's victims. He was laughing, too. He was actually laughing, using Rimmer's vocal cords and Rimmer's laugh. The high-pitched giggle which Rimmer usually reserved for moments of high humour, hardly appropriate in a pitched battle to the death.
"Out the back!"
Tonto was yelling.
"You go!"
Jimmy laughed in Rimmer's body.
"I got me some goons to kill!"
"Leave it. You don't stand a chance."
"Who cares?"
He flicked his guns Cagney style, as if the wrist-snapping motion would give the bullets extra speed, and howled hysterically as small explosions of red burst out of the chests of 3 of the 6 guards, killing 2 and earning the 3rd a permanent desk job. Rimmer cowered, half dazed in his new body as this fresh horror unfolded in slow motion before him. Here was the body of Arnold J. Rimmer, gunning down security guards like ducks at an arcade and plainly enjoying it in full view of 3 police witnesses. Now how was that going to look in court? He wasn't in it, but his body was a cop killer. This seemingly untoppable horror was then topped by an even more untoppable horror moments later, and this second untoppable horror was then topped itself by a third, even more untoppable horror less than 10 seconds after that. Something that belonged inside Rimmer's body hit the wall wetly, and Jimmy screeched and spun round, clutching Rimmer's shoulder.
"I've been hit!"
He giggled. Then his elbow exploded into a cloud of red mist, spinning him around again.
"Twice!"
He snorted laughter spittle as Tonto laid down some covering fire and edged towards him.
"Come on, we can still get out."
Tonto grabbed Jimmy and hauled him through the doorway, still firing. Rimmer stumbled after them. They dashed down a corridor, Tonto and Jimmy effortlessly accelerating away. Rimmer couldn't keep up. For some reason, running was incredibly painful, but the pain wasn't in his legs, it was in his chest. Just what was this body he'd wound up in? A cardiac victim? A chronic smoker? Then he realized it was because he wasn't wearing a bra, and his large breasts were bouncing madly up and down in front of him.
"Oh my God!"
he screamed in a husky female voice.
"I'm a woman!"
And he was. He was Trixie LaBouche. Tonto sat by the window of the nylon-sheeted bed hotel room and looked down at the human sewage below as it went about its sleazy business. The Hotel Paradiso sign parked outside his window sprayed its pink vomit into the room 3 seconds in every 10. Rimmer's nostrils splayed rhythmically as Jimmy snored down them, sleeping off a bottle of medicinal no-star brandy, his wounded arm bound and slinged by strips of hotel room curtain. Rimmer stood in his plain red dress, trying to remain upright on the grease skating rink of a kitchen floor, sawing through a cob of stale bread. The Hotel Paradiso had only 2 suites. Each of the suites had a kitchen, a lounge area, and generally speaking, they boasted fewer roaches than the ordinary rooms.
"We don't want no dive,"
Jimmy had insisted at the desk, bright plumes of blood pulsing between the fingers holding his shoulder.
"We're class. We'll take a suite."
The booking clerk tucked Tonto's dirty wad of money into his waistband and immediately forgot he'd ever met them. That had been 2 days ago. Jimmy had spent most of the time out of his head on cheap brandy, slowly recovering. Tonto had whiled away the 2 days sitting on the cigar-burned sofa, stabbed through with springs, playing patience with 3/4 of a deck of cards he'd found in the fridge. Rimmer had been forced to spend most of his time in the kitchen preparing meals or doing Jimmy and Tonto's laundry. It had also fallen to him to make the beds, keep the rooms tidy, and produce the constant flow of thick black coffee which seemed to rate second only to oxygen in Jimmy and Tonto's requirements. He'd argued at first. Why didn't they share the chores? Why was it always down to him? His arguments were always countered with the witty ripostes of sardonic laughter and occasionally flat-handed slaps across his face. He was a woman. End of argument. The slaps across his face hurt his woman's body more than any punch he'd ever received as a man. It hurt physically, yes, but it was the hollow feeling of helplessness, defenselessness, vulnerability that caused the real deep pain. These guys were brutes. They were stronger than him. If they wanted to hit him, they could, and he was powerless to stop them. Also the slaps on the arse, the lewd innuendo, the revolting insult words, and almost as bad, the patronizing pet names, sugar, honey, sweetie, doll. And his opinions didn't count in the same way they used to. Suddenly he wasn't supposed to worry his pretty little head about anything more demanding than smoothing the bedsheets. Suddenly, any criticisms he offered constituted nagging. Any conversation he started was yakking on about nothing. He felt semi-visible, only half there in the eyes of Jimmy and Tonto. Of course, the Jitterman brothers weren't exactly the 2 best-adjusted examples of manhood around, but there were plenty more like them, plenty more, and more still who held similar prejudices, but enforced them more mildly. And Rimmer, God help him, had been one of them. Tonto got up.
"We got any food, chick?"
Look, I'm a man. True, I'm a man trapped inside a woman's body, but I'm still a man. Stop calling me chick.
Tonto laughed.
"You don't look like a man."
He slapped Rimmer's backside and opened the door.
"I'm going out to spend what's left of the money. Clean up this dirt hole before I get back, or I'll mop the floor with you."
You're scum!
Tonto laughed again and left. Having spent the last couple of days in a female body, it was gradually dawning on Rimmer that his own attitude to women was possibly a tad on the weird side. The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced this was the case. All the women his subconscious had created in Better Than Life were either nymphomaniacs or hookers. Juanita, Trixie LaBouche, the Rimettes. Now he stopped to think about it. The Rimettes, the adolescent mob of sex-crazed, panty-hurling teenage girls who followed him everywhere when he'd been rich and famous, all these women, every last one of them, had existed outside Better Than Life. The Rimettes were composed entirely of women who'd rejected Rimmer in reality, women who'd refused to date him, women who had dated him once and hadn't wanted to date him again, women he hadn't even dared ask out on dates, knowing that rejection was inevitable. What this said about the state of his mind, he decided not to investigate. He started to think about Juanita instead. Then he wished he hadn't. Juanita had existed in reality too. Only she hadn't been Brazilian, she'd been French. And she wasn't called Juanita, she was called Janine. Janine Rimmer, the wife of his brother Frank. Rimmer sagged to the bed and held his rubber-gloved hands to his woman's face. Then he started to think about Helen, his second wife. She hadn't been a nymphomaniac or a prostitute. She was frigid. That's why he'd liked her. She had made him feel safe. There was something about Helen, a certain quality. He'd known Helen in reality, too. Who was she? The game had made her younger. Mentally, Rimmer aged her face. She was his She was his She was his mother. He'd married his Rimmer was coming to the conclusion that his own mind wasn't exactly a terrific place to be trapped in when Tonto returned from his shopping trip and threw a bag onto the table.
That's the last of the bread. These are for you.
For me? You spent the last of the money on me?
Rimmer smiled and peered into the bag. Maybe Tonto wasn't all bad after all. He reached in and pulled out a handful of cheap nylon underwear, peephole bra, open-crotch panties, garter belt with metal studs on, and various other paraphernalia.
What the hell's this junk for?
We got no money,
said Tonto.
Time for you to go hooking.
Trixie LaBouche, aka Arnold J. Rimmer, strode down the main street of the red light district, with Tonto following 4 or 5 paces behind. Rimmer didn't know whether his stockings were too small, or whether he'd just put them on wrong, but both his legs felt like they were spring-loaded. The 8-inch heels on his stilettos didn't help much either. He felt like he was leaning out of the door of an aircraft at 2,000 feet. The combination of stockings and stilettos forced him to adopt a rather unnatural gait, like a speeded-up goose step, as if his legs were constantly trying to escape him. Also, he discovered, he needed at least 4 seconds' notice to stop. He hurried along, trying to tug down his absurdly short black rubber skirt so that it at least covered the red nylon garter that was cutting off the circulation of his right leg, and offered some small protection against the sharp night air that whistled cruelly through his open-crotch panties. He had to escape. He had to. He knew now his psyche was punishing him, and yes, he deserved to be punished. But he'd learned his lesson. Enough was enough. But did his psyche know that? Just how far was it prepared to go? Tonto whistled, and 4 paces later Rimmer stopped. Tonto went over and started talking to an Armenian sailor, leaning in a shop doorway, chewing his way through a bagful of garlic cloves. Now was the time. He had to get out. He had to get out of Better Than Life. What was it Crichton had told him? Imagine an exit gate, and once you pass through it, you're back in reality. Tonto and the sailor walked over to join him. The Armenian leered, showing 3 silver teeth, and looked Trixie LaBouche's body up and down.
Nice piece of ass, he said. Okay, $3.
Nice piece of what?
Smiled Rimmer politely.
Nice piece of little chicken ass,
grinned the Armenian.
Can't wait to get my teeth into it.
Well, while you're waiting,
Rimmer grinned back,
why don't you get your teeth stuck into this?
He slammed the corner of his shoulder bag into the Armenian's leer and brought his right knee up between the sailor's legs. As the Armenian concertinaed neatly to the floor, Rimmer swiveled round and imagined the exit gate. The pink neon archway materialized across the street, and he ran towards it, Tonto in pursuit. Unencumbered by stilettos, Tonto was naturally faster, but surprise had given Rimmer a 10-feet start, and he reached the exit a good yard or so ahead of the furious psychopathic hippie. Rimmer dived through the exit gate, but hit something hard and unyielding, and bounced back out again. He tried a second time, same result.
Tonto grabbed Trixie's peroxide hair and hauled Rimmer up to face level.
Don't get cute, sweetie.
Don't move, Jitterman!
Tonto's eyes clicked right. The police officer crouched behind a parked car, his long-stemmed gun trained on Tonto.
The party's over, Jitterman!
Hey,
said Tonto with a demi-smile.
the party ain't over till there's only Cinzano left to drink.
Huh?
Tonto pushed Rimmer aside and went for the gun in his waistband. He never made it. 5 bullets thudded into his chest and he slithered down a car. Then he said the classic final line from Young, Bad, and Dangerous to Know.
Life is like a joystick.
Blood gurgled from the corner of his mouth.
It stinks, and then it's over.
On reflection, Rimmer thought as he scurried down the street, maybe it wasn't such a classic line after all. He doubled back to the hotel. The exit hadn't worked. Why? There could be only one answer. They'd all joined the game together. The headsets were interconnected. It was a shared scenario. They all had to leave together. Jimmy Jitterman in Rimmer's body stood on the steps of the Hotel Paradiso, engaged in a pitched battle to the death with 15 officers of the Special Weapons and Tactics Unit. He was taking on an entire SWAT team single-handed in Rimmer's body. 300 bullets Gouda cheesed Jimmy Jitterman out of existence, and a second volley completely obliterated Rimmer's old body. Rimmer, in Trixie LaBouche's body, continued running. There was only one place to go now, Bedford Falls.